Oh, I know that sound. It's time for the Beer and News Report. Hi, and welcome to the Beer and News Report. Cheers. Today, I'm drinking Erdinger Brewhaus Helles by Erdinger Westbrau Brewery. That's a hard one to say. This is a Helles-style lager made in Germany. And as you know, I like lagers, and this one is really smooth, light, with a touch of sweetness. So it goes down real nice. It's quite refreshing. If you like lagers, I recommend you give this one a try. All right? Cheers. I recently read this book called Supercommunicators by Charles Duhigg. It's how to unlock the secret language of connection. I found this book super interesting. The show today is basically a book report on supercommunicators. I'm going to break down step by step how to be a supercommunicator in case you don't like to read. Also, the story at the end is awesome. It totally caught me by surprise. So grab a notepad, a pen or a pencil, and of course a beer, and let's get started. Cheers. It starts out with a story about Jim Lawler, who was a spy for the CIA. He was having trouble recruiting people to be informants for him. These are foreign dignitaries, but they all just brushed him off. So finally he met this lady named Yasmin. He tried to get her, well, he actually lied to her. He said that he owned an oil company. Now, Jim's boss said that he needed to come clean with this lady because she could get in real trouble with her government if they find out. So he takes her out to dinner again. He says, hey, I'm a CIA agent. I'm not really an oil business magnate. But he would like to have her spy for him. And she's like freaking out. She goes, what? And she tells him, you know, if the government finds out, I'm going to get murdered, and takes off crying. So then Jim goes back to work and he tells his boss, hey, I lost her. And he decides that he's going to have one more dinner with her and just apologize. And, you know, he's thinking in his head, maybe I'll quit work, whatever. So he talks to Yasmin. She agrees. They have one more dinner. And Jim apologized to her. And he was saying that he was an oil company owner just to kind of win her over so they could talk. Then he was possibly going to get fired because he told this lie. And he's just terrible at his job. And he goes on and talks about how he feels about it and how he grew up and how he came into the CIA business, and she relates to him. And it was a long talk together, and she finally agrees, you know what? I am going to become a spy for you. And she turns out to be this excellent spy. And Jim figures out that his method of recruiting is to make connection and to show feelings. And he becomes one of the best recruiters in the CIA. In fact, he goes on to teach classes for the new spies on how to recruit people. And that's the basis of this book and this show. So, let's see how it's done, okay? Cheers. Now, I'm just going to give you an outline of this book. If you want more details, you just have to read it. As with most things in life, nothing is easy. If it was, well, it would all be supercommunicators. Okay? So the first thing you need to know is that there's three types of conversation. One, it's the conversation of, what is this really about? This type of conversation is a decision-making mindset. The second type is, how do we feel? This type of conversation is more emotional. And then the third one is, who are we? And this type of conversation is in the social mindset. Now, how do you know which type of conversation you're in? Well, if you're in the decision-making conversation, the talk is on the practical side. The person wants some help or some advice. If it's the emotional conversation, this person wants empathy. And if it's really deep, then maybe they want a hug or some form of gentle physical contact. And if it's the social conversation, then the person wants to be heard. And this doesn't mean that they're angry or venting. They just want you to know their opinion. Okay, so once you figure out which type of conversation it is, then you follow these four rules. 1, pay attention to what kind of conversation is occurring. 2, share your goals and ask what other people are seeking. 3, ask about others' feelings and share your own. And then 4, explore if identities are important to this discussion. No matter which type of conversation you're having, these four rules apply. All right, now let's figure out how to do this. Cheers. Okay, once the conversation is started, simply asking someone what they need, we encourage a learning conversation, a dialogue that helps us discover what everyone wants. And that means asking questions. But your questions need to show that you're interested in trying to understand the conversation. Usually that means repeating what the speaker said and then asking your question. For example, you could start out by saying, let me get this clear. You said blah, 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 but what if, and then this is where you ask your question. You want to use the technique called matching principle. This communication requires recognizing what kind of conversation you're in and then matching it. Mimicry isn't enough. You have to show empathy. If someone reveals something devastating, like a scary diagnosis or a death in the family, it doesn't bring us together if we use that as an excuse to talk about our own health or our family or a member who we lost a long time ago. You don't want to steal the spotlight. They are the center of attention, not you. Most people know that in a conversation, you don't want to ask closed questions, meaning these are questions that can be answered with a yes or no. You want to ask open questions that require the speaker to go on in detail. There's a trick to this, though. The deeper the question, the better the conversation. Let me give you a couple examples. So a closed question would be, hey, are you a teacher? And they can say yes or no. An open question would be, what do you teach? And they can say, well, I teach math to sixth graders. Now, a deep question is, how did you decide to become a teacher? Right? Because it's probing them. It's asking them their feelings. And let me do another example. Do you like to travel? Well, that could be answered with a yes or no. That's a closed question. A little deeper would be, where have you gone? And they may say, Europe. I've been to France and Germany. The really deep one is, what was it like to visit Europe? Right? So then you're asking them to really express feelings. You want to ask questions that bring out the speaker's beliefs, values, their experiences, or for them to make a judgment. As in, are you glad you went to law school? Are you getting the hang of it now? Cheers. There's a technique that will help you in your conversations, and this technique is called looping for understanding. Here's how looping for understanding works. First, you ask questions. Then, you summarize what you heard. Next, you ask if you got it right, and if you did, you move on to the next question. Some guidelines to this is that you want people to tell stories about their own experiences and not about things that they've heard or seen online. You want to stick to people's memories, feelings, and perceptions. You want to stay away from people offering lessons or takeaways. Sometimes in your conversation, you will erupt into a conflict. And in a conflict, everyone craves control. But trying to control someone is destructive. One technique to resolving a conflict is to slow down. You need to exert a lot of self-control and self-awareness. Don't yell or react fast. You've got to stay calm. Again, the matching principle works great here. This is when you follow someone else's lead and you become emotional when they're emotional, or you become practical when they're practical. You're sharing control over how the dialogue flows. One of the worst things you can do in a conversation is called a sweeping statement. And a sweeping statement is when you give a broad example of why something is the way it is. For instance, you don't want to say, everyone knows that's not true, or something like, you always get this wrong. It's better to be specific, as in, why did you leave the dishes in the sink last night? This way you are not overwhelming the other person. These are the techniques that the book talks about, and it goes into more detail. And there are some other techniques that I didn't have time to explain, but if you like so far, I highly recommend you read this book. All right? Cheers. Finally, I want to talk about the ending story in the book because it's fascinating. In 1937, this chain store magnate named Billy Grant approached Harvard with a proposition. He wanted them to do some general research on healthy young men, and this was going to be a long-term longitudinal study. The study would go over decades and examine the problem of nature versus nurture, the connections between personality and health, whether mental or physical illness can be predicted, and how constitutional considerations might influence the career choice. Basically, the study was going to collect data on people's fitness, families, schooling, work, emotional impulses, and physical characteristics. The participants will undergo extensive on-campus medical exams and psychological interviews, and then asked to fill out a detailed survey, delivered by mail or by home visits of the researchers. This will go on for the rest of their lives. Over time, more than 2,000 men and women were poked, prodded, interviewed, and psychologically analyzed. Originally, this was called the Grant Study because that was the guy's name, but today it's called the Harvard Study because obviously it's being done at Harvard. So it's the Harvard Study of Adult Development, and it's one of the largest, longest, and most famous studies in the world. One of the first participants in the study was Godfrey Camel, who research determined was a neurotic hypochondriac. He had been raised away from families and children because his parents were pathologically suspicious. And the researchers that interviewed Camel's mother had deemed her one of the most nervous people I have ever met. And the psychologists determined that Camel had one of the bleakest childhood we had ever seen. He was skinny, physically weak, and struggling to make friends. At age 35, he was hospitalized for 14 months for pulmonary tuberculosis. He later told researchers, I'm glad to be sick, and I'm going to go to bed for a year. Another participant at the beginning was John Marsden. He was an exceptional student. He came from a wealthy and prominent family. Rather than joining the family business, he followed his own passion and enrolled in the University of Chicago's law school, where he graduated at the top of his class. He became a public service lawyer, got married, and eventually started a successful private practice. So, we now have two people at opposite ends of the spectrum. What comes next? Yeah, cheers. In 1954, 16 years after the study began, the funds ran out. Billy Grant had donated the equivalent of $7 million in today's money and was frustrated that the study hadn't revealed that much that was helpful to him in selecting people for management. With the support all dried up and final reports were written and farewells were made, the study was boxed up and stashed in the basement of the medical school. Then, in the early 1970s, a group of young psychiatric professionals started digging around those boxes and stumbled upon the project surveys. Intrigued, they began tracking down the participants, sending them new questionnaires and scheduling for follow-up interviews. They expected to find that most participants had kept traveling along the same trajectory as when the study had ended. When they spoke to Kimmel and Marsden, though, they discovered their assumptions were completely wrong. In an interview decades later, it seemed Kimmel had become a different person. Now in his 50s, married, a leader in his church, and had won over Boston's medical establishment by funding a large independent clinic that specialized in allergy treatments. He was a nationally recognized expert on asthmatic patients, invited to symposiums, and interviewed on television. When researchers spoke to his daughters, they were now young adults. They called him an exemplary father, someone with the innate ability to just give. At 80, Kimmel threw himself a potluck birthday party, and more than 300 people showed up. At 82 years old, he went on a climbing trip to the Alps with some of his friends and died. At his memorial, the church was packed. But what happened to Marsden? Well, let's find out. In contrast, Marsden, the lawyer, was in terrible shape when researchers found him after the study's hiatus. In his 50s now, he was divorced and alienated from his children and his family in Cleveland. Though his practice was successful, he had few friends and spent most of his time alone. He reported feeling angry, lonely, and disappointed by life. Eventually remarried, but in just a few years later, reported that the relationship was loveless. When asked how he coped with difficulty, Martin wrote, "I keep it to myself. I tough it out." Eventually, Marsden stopped responding to the interview requests. When his survey was returned unopened, they found out that he had actually died. How was this possible, the researchers wondered, that things could have turned out so unexpectedly for these two men? Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. Cheers. When they compared the other participants, they found out a number of them, men and women, who seemed to have bright futures and were seemingly destined for greatness and ended up, instead, lonely and desperate adults, dissatisfied with their lives. Whereas others who faced crippling obstacles such as mental health and poverty had arrived at old age happy and successful and surrounded by family and friends. Researchers discovered some correlations, like having loving parents that made it easier to find happiness as an adult. Possessing genes related to physical hardiness and longevity was also helpful, as well as getting enough exercise and eating well. Education early in life, as well as a lifelong commitment to learning, also provided a leg up. However, as important as these factors, one thing seems to matter more than anything else. The most important variable in determining whether someone ended up happy and healthy or miserable and sick was how satisfied they were in their relationships. People who were the most satisfied in a relationship at the age 50 were the healthiest mentally and physically at age 80. One researcher put it blunt: the most important influence by far on a flourishing life is love. Not romantic love, but rather the kinds of deep connections formed of their families, friends, and co-workers, as well as neighbors and people from other communities. Participants who ended up happy all had warm adult relationships with numerous people. They had good marriages, were close to their children, and had invested in long, strong friendships. I think this story is great. It really made my day. To me, the key thing to get out of this is to go out there and meet people. Make some new friends, or volunteer, or join a club or sport. Basically, the key to happiness is in your control. Cheers. Well, as you can see, my beer is almost empty. That means we're at the end of the show. If you want to contact me, if you reach this email address. I hope you had a good time watching the show, and please click that book if you really are interested. It's very good in reading. Please click that like button, and of course, if you want to get notified of a new show, you click that subscribe button, the little bell icon next to it, and this will notify you when a new show has been posted. Until then, keep your beer cold and your interest hot. Cheers.